Anyway, thanks everyone for joining tonight's event. My name's Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. And before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many events we're looking forward to is Lisa Wells in conversation with Lydia Millette about Wells' new nonfiction book, Believers, Making a Life at the End of the World. That's going to be next Tuesday, the 27th. And if you don't already do so, please follow us on social media. You'll be up to date on all of the events that we're doing and everything happening in our stores as well. Tonight, we're so thrilled to welcome Patrick Wyman and Mike Duncan. Patrick Wyman holds a PhD in history from the University of Southern California. He previously worked as a sports journalist covering mixed martial arts and boxing from 2013 to 2018. He's currently host of the podcast Tides of History and previously the host of Fall of Rome. Wyman's new book, The Verge, tells the story of a period that marked a decisive turning point for both European and world history. Wyman examines two complementary and contradictory sides of the same historical coin: the world-altering implications of the developments of printed mass media, extreme taxation, exploitative globalization, humanistic learning, gunpowder warfare, and mass religious conflict in the long term, and their intensely disruptive consequences in the short term. As told through the lives of 10 real people, from famous figures like Christopher Columbus and wealthy banker Jakob Fugger to a ruthless small-time merchant and one armed mercenary captain, The Verge illustrates how their lives and the times in which they live set the stage for an unprecedented globalized future. Over an intense 40-year period, the seeds for the so-called Great Divergence between Western Europe and the rest of the globe would be planted. From Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic to Martin Luther's sparking the Protestant Reformation, the foundations of our own recognizably modern world came into being. For the past 500 years, historians, economists, and the policy-oriented have argued which of these individual developments best explains the West's rise from backwater periphery to global dominance. As The Verge presents us, however, the answer is far more nuanced than that. He joins us tonight from Phoenix, Arizona. Joining Wyman in conversation this evening is Mike Duncan. Duncan is one of the most popular history podcasters in the world and author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Storm Before the Storm. His award-winning series, The History of Rome, remains a landmark in the history of podcasting. Duncan's ongoing series, Revolutions, explores the great political revolutions that have driven the course of modern history. His next book, Hero of Two Worlds, The Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution, will publish next month on August 24th. And he's joining us tonight from Madison, Wisconsin. This evening's event includes an audience Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you like a question that somebody has asked, you can click the thumbs up and upvote that question. There's a lot of people viewing tonight, so we'll probably have a lot of questions. More importantly, please consider supporting Patrick and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new book from us. A link to buy The Verge, along with a link to Mike's book, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. Patrick, Mike, it's so wonderful to welcome you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And Mike, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man. I'm really glad to be here. So we've got about an hour here. It's 7:07 my time. So you guys out there know that you should buy The Verge and you should read The Verge. And I would also encourage you to buy The Verge and read The Verge, because I read it and I thought it was fantastic. And but we don't want to do like a book report here about The Verge, and we don't want to do like just like an author profile of Patrick. And we were talking about what would be like a nice thing to talk about here. And really, we want to talk about sort of the process of putting history together, putting narrative history together, what we do. We both have very similar sort of backgrounds and experiences in podcasting and in nonfiction book writing now. So I just kind of want to dive into some questions because me and Patrick are going to talk for a little bit here. And then as questions come in, like probably with about 20 minutes left, I'll turn it over and as much as possible, get into audience questions. And just know that if I don't read your question, it's because it's a personal thing and it's definitely just me, ignoring you. So there's probably going to be a lot of them. So what I want to start with though, Patrick, is you have written a book. There's a physical book with your name on it. How does that feel?
It feels completely surreal because Mike, you were actually present at the very beginning of this process. You and I went out and we got beers and I was bouncing my ideas for this book off of you. And you're like, you have to start with Christopher Columbus. You have to. So I did start with Christopher Columbus. You were absolutely right about that. But that was like 3 years ago. So to watch something go from being the topic of conversation over beers to holding a physical book in your hand, it's wild. It's totally wild. I don't know any other way to put it. And I mean, you know how that feels. It's like, it's a totally insane kind of thing to watch an idea grow from being a total hypothetical to being something that you can physically put out into the world and have people engage with.
And was your desire to write a book a very recent phenomenon in your life? Is it something that you've maybe dreamed about since you were a child?
I would say I have dreamed about it since I was a small child because
right.
And it's really special to me for us to be doing this through Powell's, because Powell's is like my favorite place in the world. I went there, every few weeks when I was a kid, whenever we were visiting my grandparents in Portland. I've spent way too much money at Powell's over the years. And so it feels in some way like coming full circle that I remember walking through the history section at Powell's and thinking like, hey, could I ever write a book that ends up on the shelves of the history section at Powell's? Like, well, maybe if I work real hard, I can eventually someday that can happen. And now here we are doing a virtual event in the midst of a pandemic.
That's right. Congratulations. This is all just to start this with a huge congratulations. We're all very proud of you.
Thanks, Mike.
So what I think maybe we can start with here is, we both come at this from sort of history podcasting, popularizing history podcasting with a microphone in front of us and putting out episodes. And then there is writing a book, which is a much different kind of burden, a much different process, a much different endeavor, really. And so can you just talk about what changes you made to what voice you were using or how you approached one versus the other? Like, did you feel different writing it? Did you feel a different voice come out?
Yeah, so I got very in my head early on in the process of writing the book, especially as I was working on the sample chapter that I sent out to publishers to try to get them to buy the book. I was very conscious in my head of like, well, it has to be a book. It has to sound like a book. It has to be book-like or at least book adjacent. And that is a much different thing than writing a podcast script. Your readers, your listeners are engaging with you much differently. If you're listening to a podcast in the car as you're commuting to work, at least hopefully you're paying some attention to the road as you're doing this. So there's kind of there's a way in which you can repeat yourself. You can go back over things. You can kind of layer the words that you're using, the descriptions. It's just you end up with a kind of a much different effect. You're writing for the ear and you're mimicking speech. And sometimes conversation. Even if you're aware that that's not actually the thing that you're putting down on the page, you're trying to come up with some sort of reasonable simulacrum of that so that it makes it easier for your listeners to engage with you. Book writing, by its nature, you don't have to do that. If somebody reads something, if they read the words on the page, you don't have to pretend that you're having a conversation. You don't have to, you're not writing for the ear, you're writing for the eye. And that's a much different kind of thing. I think what I tried to do, what I tried to carry over from podcast writing was the sense of latching on to something real in a moment and using that as an entry point into a broader world. So the idea of taking a smell, a sound, a particular image, and using that to take the reader into a point in time that is real, no matter how distant we are from a time in the past, from a place, from these people, there's still got to be something that we can hang on to there. And so that's what I wanted to get across, this experiential sense of being in the past as an entry point to getting into the kind of bigger, broader questions and processes that define history.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just going to use that to roll into one of the other questions that I have here, which is, I think that each one of these chapters, which is, each chapter is kind of about a discrete person and a discrete idea that all meshes together and tells like a complete story about what was going on during this particular 40-year period. But you do a really great job setting it up in a literary style. I mean, you're not doing fiction writing, but when I open up a page, I'm on the deck of a ship with, there's ropes creaking and wind is howling and, the ship is rocking, or maybe I'm standing in front of, was it Rome that was being besieged? Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, of course. I want to make sure I got the siege of Rome in there. I went there and there's armor clinking and I'm actually there. And I thought that this was really great because many of the topics, right? Let's be clear. Like one of the chapters, and probably my favorite chapter in the book, is about the life and times of like some kind of medium time wool merchant in England. And we are talking about his account ledgers, and we're talking about double entry bookkeeping. And this is not like automatically the most fascinating stuff in the world. But it is, of course, fascinating, but it's not gripping. And this could very easily have trended into just being kind of dry and turgid and not very engaging. But you do such a great job framing it around a person who I can connect to, and painting these pictures that I can connect to, that I'm able to get the information that ultimately the book is trying to impart. The book is trying to impart this information to me so that I do walk away believing that this was an important period in time, which I did. So was that something that you thought about from the very beginning? Was that something that, developed over time? Were you writing it and were like, I don't know if this is working, or was that your idea going into it?
I think I felt like I had to do it because it's the only way I know to bring people in. I have a friend, a very dear friend, who's a TV writer, and he spends a lot of time in a writer's room with, other very, very talented writers. And when they have one of these things, they call them like cave paintings, that when they can latch on to a sensation, an image, a feeling, something that feels like it has some meaning, like it has some oomph to it, that then you can build outward from there. And that's how I start all of these things, because I feel like talking about a process like the rise of the state, like, well, what is the rise of the state?
Totally. That's like so abstract.
It's a completely abstract thing. And what starting with one of these sensations or images or a smell is fantastic. That it's evocative of the world, and it reminds you that it's a real time and place, and that these are real people who are going through this stuff. Whatever that is, whether that's besieging the city of Rome, or just haggling over the price of some wool, there's a real world there. There are real sensations and feelings that go along with that. They may not necessarily be our own. They may be engaging with the world in a dramatically different way than we are. They may understand the things that they're seeing, smelling, experiencing, and feeling much differently than us, but that it is nevertheless real. And I can understand how some of my more academically minded colleagues might disagree with this approach. I think that's totally fine. It's just, to me, it feels viable to latch on to something that we know must have happened. We know that there must have been armor jangling because, well, stuff's metal, man. Like that, it's clanking. We know that this is happening. We know that there are bells ringing. We know that we have a pretty good sense.
Do you have a citation for the armor clinking in battle?
Yeah, I've got a book on metal, like armor metallurgy in the late 15th century. Have a citation for that. I don't think I have a citation for the jangling, but I do know that book. It's a good book. I wouldn't recommend it as pleasure reading, but it does exist. So I feel like it's okay to take a reasonable supposition about this. It's okay to know that, like, lots of feet marching together make a sound. We can have a good sense for that. And I don't feel like I'm overstepping my bounds as an interpreter of the past in giving some life to that. They are, at the end of the day, my own interpretations. And I would never try to say that I'm like describing reality. I'm trying to provide a simulacrum or a hint or like a taste of something that can feel real. And like I feel like I'm in pretty decent company with that, because even people who write memoirs, like I've been reading a lot of war memoirs lately, they talk about how what they're describing is not real so much as it is their perception or their experience of it,
Mhm.
and that can differ from objective reality in a whole bunch of different ways, but what I've noticed is that in their descriptions of these of reality, they tend to latch on to these little images or these smells. And so I feel like whatever the problems with that methodologically, I don't feel like I'm doing a disservice to the past by taking that approach. I worry about this. I mean, like, it's something I think about and I worry about, like, am I leading people astray? And that's how I at least convince myself that I'm not.
Yeah, and I mean, for the record, I don't think you are, and this will lead very nicely into my next question, because, um, who are we writing for here? I mean, this is a thing where it's like, I don't want to say like a little sugar helps the medicine go down, but there is an entry that we should be offering to people, and I don't think that that's a bad thing, and I think that that's a very normal thing. If you were going to turn it in, for like a PhD thesis, it wouldn't be there. But if you would like to impart information to people who are just out there in the world, then I think setting the scene for it is really good. And especially because like you get that, and then you're just rolling into like, very critical analysis of like, the relative weights and measures, and like like what is the relative value of like a Dutch guilder like I'm getting all of the stuff that I need to read. But like, I got some color along the way, and somebody to kind of follow along with. I got a guy hustling down the street with a arms under his book, and he's got a pissed off father-in-law he's got to deal with, which I like, because my book has a pissed off father-in-law too. Both of our books have pissed off father-in-laws as like a stock character. So a good sort of question that comes out of that is, who are you writing for? Like, in your head, I think most authors have somebody that they're writing for. And I've said, like, personally for me, I actually have two writers that I work for. One is somebody who is going to be walking into whatever I'm talking about for the very first time and doesn't know anything. And I want to be able to paint a very clear picture of what's going on, and I want to build from the ground up, so that they don't feel like they were left behind. And that, even if you don't know anything, I will start when Aeneas shows up in Italy. That's where we're going to start the history of Rome from. And then my other reader is somebody I keep in mind, somebody who's like an expert in the field of whatever it is that I'm talking about, whether it's a period in Roman history or whether it's a particular geographic location, that if they were to read what I was writing, there's a very specific response I'm going for. And that specific response is, yeah, this is pretty good. Like the expert, nothing that I think a popular historian, like such as myself or like you, is ever going to completely satisfy an expert in the field, because there's such an amount of detail and nuance. And, there's a million different arguments that you kind of have to just rise above if you're going to talk about it. But I always want whatever the expert is to be, who's might be looking over my shoulder, to be very satisfied with what I'm putting out. So I kind of write for both of those. Who are you writing for? Like, who's in your head when you're sitting down to try to type this stuff up?
So aside from my graduate school advisor and just like a kind of a hangover of always being worried about getting ripped to shreds in some kind of seminar, like just that's like PTSD from being in grad school. Aside from that, it's funny, you describe having two readers in mind. I only really have one, but he represents a midpoint between those two readers that you talked about. I'm basically writing for my dad. So my dad is like the world's most prolific reader of popular history, I think, and he's got very highly developed tastes for what he's looking for. The book has to be entertaining. It has to have a story. It can't. The worst thing that my dad can say about a book is that it's kind of slow going or is a little dry here. Like, that's the last thing I want. So I want to know that my dad is going to read this and he's going to get the stuff out of it, that he's going to be entertained as he's reading it. And at the same time, that all of that other stuff, all of the research, all of the academic work is there and present, so that if an expert were to go over it, they would say, okay, yeah, this person knows what they're talking about. This person is not committing any egregious errors. And I'm not arrogant enough to think that like real experts in the financial history of the 15th and 16th centuries are going to read this and like that it's going to blow their minds with with some new discovery about it. I do hope that they'll read it and they'll be like, yeah, I think that is an adequate representation of the scholarship, and maybe there's something in there that I can think about slightly differently. right? Like that's all I want. If that is done, then I feel like I have satisfied that particular end of the spectrum. That where I think history podcasting and popular history writing have something deeply in common is that your reader can always put the book down, your listener can always turn off the show, right? So it is incumbent upon us to engage with our audience, and the way to do that is with narrative. Like among academic historians of a certain age and era, narrative is a dirty word. Because we're all aware of how constructed narrative is. We all know that depending on what events you pick and what order you put them in and what emphasis you give them and what adjectives you use to describe people, that you're going to be able to tell much different stories out of the same set of facts, right? But I feel like we're narrative creatures, and the fact that narrative has these shortcomings, or not even shortcomings, characteristics, that these are the characteristics of narrative, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use it. It's a tool in our toolbox in the same way that philological analysis is a tool in our toolbox, or like the linguistics are a tool, or archaeology is a tool, or dendrochronological dating is a tool. All of these things are things that we can use to understand and explain the past. But like, if you get a couple of dendrochronologists in a room, they're going to argue about tree rings until the cows come home. Like, they're gonna all of these things have their shortcomings and downfalls and pitfalls, things that we got to be aware of as we're using them. That doesn't mean that we just toss the tool to the side, because there's people understand the world through stories and through narrative. And if we just toss that tool aside, then we're missing out on the possibility of engaging a whole bunch of people with this information that we would like to think matters.
I completely agree with you, obviously, because I mean, that's my whole thing is narrative history.
Quite literally preaching to the converted.
Right. That and especially what narrative history is so great for is when you want to take all of these, monographs that are sitting on shelves that are being written by the experts and being written by academics, and you want to move this information, this just amazing amounts of information that has been written into sitting on all these shelves, and you want to actually get it out to people and maybe enrich people's lives and enrich society by having a more historically literate society. I mean, I think that narrative is the very best way to tell history to people, and I think it is also sort of it's the gateway drug a little bit to history, because I think anybody can sit down and listen to a story. Anybody can sit down and listen to a story, and a well-told history story gets you saying like, oh man, that's really interesting, I want to learn more. And that's certainly like how I got into it. I was just reading whatever pop history was out there when I was a teenager, when I was young, and then I moved on to the harder stuff, a good academic monograph about trade routes in Rome and the 276 to 282, these hyper specific things, which is all great, and that's the stuff that I love to read, and I know it's the stuff that you love to read. And like you say, we don't have to have just one or the other. It's just narrative history is another thing that's out there. But it's, I think, for sure the best way to connect all of this information like to a wider audience. So
like you said, I mean, because like people can always put the book down. People can always put people can always stop listening to the show. If you're in a grad seminar and you're going to be quizzed on the contents of a book about trade routes in late imperial Rome, then you're not going to put the book down, because you know that your professional future depends on that. So you're going to read the stupid book. Our audience is not under that same obligation, and so we have to keep them. Our obligation is to keep them turning the pages, to find ways to do that. And there is I don't even think there is another way to do that aside from narrative.
Right. So, speaking of all this stuff, like, I read a bunch of books growing up that influenced me, and that no doubt affected like my worldview and how I approach things as a writer. And you have to sit down and you write this book, and like you say, you're balancing all these things. You're balancing narrative, you're balancing the amount of information. I don't want it to sound overly academic, but I also don't want it to be too light and fluffy. You're trying to satisfy your dad and your grad school advisor. Like, there's a lot going on there. So I mean, are there authors that particularly inspired you, books that particularly inspired you that you kind of look to and say, okay, well, I'm not going to maybe do it this well or like exactly this way, but this is the kind of thing I would ultimately like to try to draw out of myself.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, I think first and foremost, Barbara Tuchman. So Guns of August, A Distant Mirror, like those are two of my very favorite popular histories. I think they really hit that sweet spot of keeping you engaged, you get the sense of knowing that the narrative that's on the pages is is like the tip of an iceberg. It's like Hemingway talked about writing, that like the sentence that's on the page is only the
Mhm.
visible part of what lies underneath, you know, that like there's a whole mountain of facts and decisions that the author has made to get you to that one sentence that you're reading. I
Mhm.
always feel that way about her popular history, that that whatever choices she's making are made cognizant of that choice, right? That she knows that she's making the decision to emphasize something, to leave something out, to put something in. And I think that you can see that most in the kinds of scenes that she writes, which I've tried and probably failed to replicate. You know, like the opening scene of Guns of August, which is the funeral of the British monarch on the eve of the First World War. It's the last time that all of the, you know, the extended family of European monarchy is together. It's just such a compelling and immersive scene, that I think those two things I got from her. I think in terms of the overall historical approach, the thing that's influenced me the most is Fernand Braudel. And so the great French historian of the Annales school, but basically his whole thing, and that of the Annales school more generally, is that events, like things that happen, that's kinds of stuff that we latch onto and we think of as being the stuff of history, are just kind of the stuff on the waves, on the very surface of the ocean.
Mhm.
And that what really matters is happening under the waves. It's these much deeper kinds of structures and processes, that go on for centuries, that can move very, very, very slowly, almost imperceptibly through the lives of thousands, millions of people. And the corollary to that is that the actions of individual people matter, and that, you know, the consumption habits of your average person on the street are an impactful historical force. The ways that people pick up their tools and go to work every day, that is a meaningful historical subject to study, first of all, and also that matters, that those people have agency. The way that they go about their lives matters. It shapes that shapes the course of history as much, or I think a lot more, than the decisions of kings, popes, emperors, and other assorted, like capital G, great people. That matters to me. So even if there are quote unquote great people in this book, you know, I think that at the end of the day, what moves the world forward is these much more common people. And that's something that I think more than anybody else I've gotten from Burdell. I also got it from, you know, one of my grad school advisors, Judith Bennett, who wrote a lot of social history, women's and gender history. She introduced me to economic history. And I think economic history is far from being dry. It can be, but I think it's
Oh,
liberating.
it can be.
It can be very dry.
Oh, it
Okay,
can.
yeah,
Oh, it can be.
it is almost always really dry, but it
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
have to be, and that's because it's a democratic thing. Almost everybody is a worker. You know, there is a democratizing sense in which economic history opens the world up to analysis, and it opens up vast hordes of people who would otherwise go completely undiscussed to history, to being subjects of analysis, and to giving them agency, right? Like that's, to as much as possible. Like that's why I love the history of work. You know, that's why gender history is important too, is because these are things in which everybody is participating, which you can't always say of politics. You can't always say that of, you know, the doings of the doings of popes and kings and emperors. Like other people did stuff too. It mattered, and one of the ways that we can get at that is through work and economic history. So those folks, I mean, but I have a lot of historical fiction too. You know, I loved Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall,
Yeah.
Bernard Cornwell.
Mhm.
Like I love, God, I love those.
That's
books.
right.
Patrick O'Brien. I've been going back through the Aubrey Maturin series lately, and just, you know, that stuff is very near and dear to my heart, always will be. You know, the man himself, Dan Jones, probably one of my very favorite popular historians. I think he does a fantastic job of bridging those gaps as well. So if I could ever write anything as good as any of those folks that I've mentioned, I'll feel I don't think I'm ever going to get there, but I feel real good about that.
That's the correct level of humility. But if this is your first book, if this was your first, like, like swing at the ball, crack at the apple, like that's a metaphor that doesn't make sense. I don't know why anybody would take a crack at the apple. But since this is your first crack at the apple, I think you've probably got it in you. And I mean, and this isn't like, we didn't talk about this, but you're gonna knock out some historical fiction at some point. You're gonna give us a, you got friends, you got friends in TV, you got a book. I don't want to put you on the spot here.
I will dabble. I will probably dabble in historical fiction at some point.
Cool.
I wrote a novel that was like a knockoff of Highlander. That involved a lot of like travels through various periods of history that
Lowlander.
I will never,
a Dutch guy.
I am never going to show that shit to anybody.
Okay. Well, I mean, hey, we've all got the drawer, man. We've all got a drawer of garbage that, no,
garbage.
I have this thing that I tell people sometimes, that you have to write like 1,000,000 words. Because the first, like, it doesn't get good until you've gone through the like 1,000,000 word sedimentary layer of just absolute garbage that's in everybody. I think it's in everybody. And I have been writing like on an almost daily basis, just like in notebooks and stuff. Like I've got, crappy short stories and I have so many 1/3 of a novel, like hiding in various places. I'm the king, I'm the master of the first act. And then I'm like, I'm kind of bored with this. But you got to write before you actually hit the vein of the good words.
So I got to ask you this, because you've just finished your second book. It comes out next month. Was the process of writing the second one easier than the first one? Like, did you feel like you were better at the act of writing a book?
Yeah, I do. I think that Hero of Two Worlds is a better written book than The Storm Before the Storm is. I mean, I think Storm Before the Storm was very good, but I think what I was trying to do different things. In Storm Before the Storm, and I'll bring baseball metaphors into it because that's what I do, is I was really just trying to hit it was like, you're stepping into the plate for your first, you're a rookie, it's your first plate appearance. What are you trying to do up there? And I was not swinging for the fences. I wasn't trying to be like, a literary genius right out of the bat. I just wanted to hit a nice clean signal back up the middle and just get on base. That's what I was trying to do. And so I stayed within myself more in The Storm Before the Storm, and it came off very well. And I actually think that I kind of hit maybe a double into the gap with The Storm Before the Storm. But with this one, once I had all the experience of taking a book from like nothing to end, I think that I spent a little bit more time on the literary quality of the sentences, trying to say things in slightly using more poetic language, not flowery. Like I'm not Cicero or anything. Like I'm never gonna go down that road. But yeah, I think I had a lot of it's just like self-confidence. Once you do it once, you feel like you can go up there and do it again, and now maybe take a swing at it. And I don't know, man, my book doesn't come out for like a month. It's gotten some good reviews, and so maybe like I hooked a homer or like around the pesky ball. And that's all I'm hoping for now.
Well, dude, it's funny, is like, first of all, writing a book is like, it's like a whole set of related skill sets, right? It's like there's a whole bunch of different things that go into it. And I think the thing that I realize now at the end of the process is that like bare competence is not easy. Like just doing a thing competently. Like this, like, so my mother-in-law works in TV, and she's like, do you know how hard it is to make bad TV? And that's the way I feel about writing a book, is that like, just like hitting a single in Major League Baseball is really hard.
They throw it really hard and the ball moves.
There's a lot that goes into that.
It's real hard. Yeah. So I just want to put it. Yeah. And and the thing is, like, in the history of Rome, I think eventually this comes out where I think by the end, especially during like most of like late antiquity, the absolute highest praise I was able to give to anybody is just like, he was extraordinarily competent, right? Like whether I'm talking about some governor or some particular emperor, like this guy was competent. And that is like in a world that was that complex, in a world that was that uncertain, when things are going crazy, just having somebody who woke up every day and diligently did the work was a profoundly meaningful thing in that time and place. So yeah, I give, when I say somebody is competent, that is like, that for me is very high praise.
100%. Like this is that, like I take competence very seriously. Okay. So we're kind of running down on time here. We got a few minutes left. I want to argue with you about something.
Right. No, this is, I was going to it.
I'm
Okay.
I'm gonna get that. So you and I both wrote books about restricted periods of time and the very important things that happen in those periods of time. You wrote about the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. I have now written about the opening decades of the 16th century. And I think very firmly that the period that you cover in The Storm Before the Storm is a more pivotal, brief period of time than the one that I cover in The Verge. So,
and I'm convinced that The Verge is a more important historical epoch than anything
wrong.
that I was writing.
You're wrong, which is cool, but you're wrong.
We've clearly convinced each other.
We have. Okay, I'm gonna tell you why I think.
Okay, why do you think? And then I'll beat you because I can beat you.
Because Rome was not a given. The Roman Empire was not a given. And if not for what happens in this period with the disintegration of the Republic, if the people who ended up winning hadn't won, like there's a very real series of scenarios, I'm sure you'd agree with this, going through those decades where everything could have fallen apart during the Social War, where Rome could have simply become just one more city in the Italian peninsula, where during that period of time, as the Romans are bound up in civil war after civil war, that what they had added as kind of like tenuously associated provinces could have split off and gone back to doing their own thing. That another conqueror could have risen up somewhere in the Hellenistic world to reassert control from the East. That there are all sorts of scenarios that were possible during that period that by the end of it were closed off. That even though Rome falls into civil war and the Republic is dying, that Rome itself was much more consolidated and in control by the 60s BC than it had been 6 decades earlier, as all of these conquests were fresh. That's my somewhat counterintuitive reason why I think that period matters more, because everything that follows after that is dependent on this one period of time having taken place.
Right. It was the sense that when Rome descended into chaos, it did not disintegrate, and in fact held itself together. Which I don't know if we've talked about this like specifically. I know it's come up, but like the question of why did the Roman Empire fall become, at least to me, is of course an interesting question. It's like one of the greatest all-time like $10,000 questions in all of history. You know, what were the causes of the French Revolution? You know, why did the Roman Empire fall? Like these things are like enormous. But for me, yeah, it's like why didn't the Roman Empire fall at that time? Why didn't the Roman Empire fall? And if Lafayette sells well, if all you people out there do the nice thing and buy my book, then maybe we'll go do a book about
buy the book. The book's real good.
Right. They will go do a book about the Christ of the third century, which is another period where we're asking the question, why didn't Rome fall? So, okay. So my thing is that it actually comes right back to something that you were saying earlier, is that my story in The Storm Before the Storm was about the breakdown of a particular form of government. There were participatory democratic elements of it. I mean, obviously it's a pretty tightly controlled oligarchy, but there were democratic elements to it. There was a participatory nature to the government. There was a system that was in place that for 500 years really had a pretty decent power sharing agreement in place between these different factions and between these different families. That then what was the thing that took that to an authoritarian system of government, from republic to dictatorship, which I think is essentially a political story. I wrote a political book about a political story because I thought it maybe had some, I don't know, salience to today, which when I wrote it, I thought it maybe would hopefully be a little prescient, and then it just became increasingly nightmarishly relevant.
Nobody wants to be Cassandra.
Yeah, I don't want to be Cassandra. I want to be wrong about all this stuff. But anyway, so I was writing a political story about a political thing that happened in history. And what you're writing about here is, as you said earlier, it's not just about consuls, kings, emperors, and sort of political machinations. You're talking about huge social change. You know, you're talking about economic, advances in banking and finance capitalism, which is like enormously important. You're talking about the colonization of, you're talking about the quote unquote discovery of, or discovery by Europeans of all of the Americas. I mean, this is like a humongously transformative event in world history. We're talking about how armies are formed and states are formed, and there's all of these sort of social things that are happening, economic things that are happening. The printing press is now, the printing press wasn't invented in this period, but this is when it really becomes a thing, becomes like a salient part of life, which triggers like the Protestant Reformation, which is this enormous religious schism, and again a giant social event. And much of the world that we're talking about right now, not just in terms of politics, but in terms of economics, in terms of social relations, in terms of the global interconnectivity, in terms of, for good and bad, a lot of bad, the conquest of Europe, or excuse me, the conquest of the world by Europe. So, and like there's an old quote from Metternich that like the three things that changed the world forever were gunpowder, the printing press, and the discovery of Americas. And like kind of two of those things, at least, and gunpowder's kind of sneaking its way in there a little bit, but we do find in the Verge like huge transformative factors. So you're talking about, I feel like I was talking about the stuff that was happening on the top of the waves and and wrote a political book about a political story, and you're talking about those people and everything that was happening underneath it. I think made a pretty good case for this being, I feel like we were on the verge of something when I finished reading this book. So that's my case for it. That I think what was going on in that period, 1490-ish to 1530-ish, is more relevant, or not relevant, but a bigger transformation than Rome 130 to 78 BC.
I understand your argument. I appreciate it. It may be in some ways an argument that I've made myself, but
I hope so. You sold the book to somebody at some point.
I sure hope so. Yeah. I still think earlier is more impactful. Because I think of all the ways in which the centuries that followed defined the landscape of Europe and beyond, right? And the ways in which this long-standing Roman world defined the future course of history and its absence too. Like the Stanford historian Walter Scheidel wrote a book called Escape from Rome about how the lack of overarching empires in Europe after Rome created this multipolar system, and that's everything I talk about in my book is downstream of that, right? But if you never have that empire in the first place, how different could things look? So that's my take. We may have to call it a draw.
Well, what we should do is encourage everyone to buy both of our books, and then they can
decide for themselves.
They can referee in their own heads. Like there's no right or wrong answer to here. Well, the wrong answer is not buying our books. The right answer.
Yeah. No, seriously, buy Hero of Two Worlds. It's incredibly entertaining. It is a fascinating read. Mike is a great guide to that whole period, the transformation of France and the kind of broader world order over those centuries. Lafayette is a great character to follow, and Mike's a great guide to it. Please buy that book.
Yeah, 1775 to 1830, very, very transformative.
Speaking of a lot of things happening.
Speaking of a lot of things happening, and this one random French marquis who just wouldn't stop showing up. Okay, so I want to move now to listener questions, and I've got a Q&A box here that I'm looking at, and it's got 56 questions in it. So we're not going to get to 56 questions, and I'm wondering is if people are out there and they can open up the Q&A box. If you slide through it, there's like a little upvote that you can give it, and if you see something in there that you want me to ask, like the upvotes kind of go to the top. And so if there's something that's in there that you think would be particularly interesting for me to ask, because I'm going to kind of start. Yeah, I can see the one at the very top is now skyrocketing. So I'm going to have to ask this one first. It says, this is from Lou, fellas, last year during your podcast together, you said the year you felt 2020 resembled the most of all the revolutions that I covered was 1848. Patrick, if you weren't aware of this, Patrick and I did a conversation about a year ago where I broke down, this is like in the summer of 2020, where I broke down how it's like, God, this is 1848 all over again.
It was early. It was even earlier than that. It was like April. It was like early April. Wow. Yeah. So we were right in it.
Dark times. I was locked in a 500 square foot apartment, just like, oh man, it's all going down.
There were a lot of screaming children.
Okay,
point.
yeah. So here's the question: is do you still feel that way? Do we still feel that way? Why or why not? So from April 2020, when we were having all that, hopefully you remember what you said. Like, what do you think? It's been a year now, or more. What do you feel about it?
So I think that our predictions held up remarkably well, considering everything that happened over the summer. That I think people were that people were fed up. And I think that we were kind of at a structural point where things were going to start breaking. The only thing that surprised me, and I suppose this probably would have surprised people early in 1848 too. You can speak to this better than I can. That there were state responses that to some extent addressed the problems that were being brought up. I was really, really pessimistic that there were going to be viable responses to, or that there were going to be viable responses to the immiseration, the economic immiseration that went along with COVID, that there were going to be reform efforts undertaken in any particular way, shape, or form, that things weren't just going to get worse. I was pretty pessimistic about that. But I feel like the core thing that we got was that things were going to change, and they were going to change in unexpected ways, and that there was going to be stuff that happens downstream of the events of 2020, both the pandemic itself and the events that happened over the summer, which I think we called pretty well. That there was going to be stuff that happened downstream of that was going to be hard to predict and hard to figure out, that there are seeds being planted that are going to bear fruit down the road.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with your take too, is that in 1848, as much because going into 1848, we're talking about the Hungry 40s, we're talking about like there's a potato blight and a potato famine, there's crop failures, that leads to a business recession, and business recession in kind of the nascent stage of like the second industrial revolution, where a lot of people are being pushed out of work, and suddenly people are home and don't have wages, and they can't afford basic necessities. And you had, all the states of Europe at the time were kind of trying to do something to mitigate the worst of it. I mean, there were poorhouses and there were workhouses, and they tried to, subsidize grain, but it was really, I mean, you're talking about really inadequate political structures to deal with it. And I too, in April of 2020, maybe given the quality of the leadership of the United States and given some of the quality of the leadership, elsewhere, I was living in Europe at the time, what are we actually going to do to address this thing, which is going to cripple the economy, but we have to do it in order to ride out a global pandemic. And ultimately the response to it, I think all the charts and graphs that kind of come through in the wake of everything that happened, once we get to the fall and we can kind of start to look back, like how did the stimulus affect things? What was the sort of dollar and cents pocketbook result of all these things? And I think the dollar and cents pocketbook response was that people kind of floated through it a little bit, and we didn't collapse into a Great Depression. That didn't happen, which was on the table.
Oh, that was very much on the table, and I think
it's
easy to forget that now in hindsight. But there was a period of time in like late March and early April of 2020 where, in the absence of ongoing, continuous intervention in the economy, that things were going to get real bad.
Yeah, and I think we're both of the opinion that probably even the stuff that went on wasn't big enough or grand enough. I think we both agree that political leadership in the world right now lacks a certain vision for what's actually happening out there in the world, and the things that we're actually confronting, that people need to think much bigger and with much more imagination about what we can do to get through it. And then, of course, the other thing, I would hate to leave this on an upbeat note, is that, this stuff all ran right through the election, and, something like January 6th happens, and we're not out of anything. The conditions that were set by the end of the Cold War, rolling into 9/11, rolling into the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which I'm a big believer people are still underrating as a major historical event, rolling into the pandemic, that we're not out of any woods yet. We will still have mobs of people, demonstrations and clashes and political upheaval for a couple of years to come.
I have one more thing I want to say about that, which is that something I've gotten from all of your work over the years, what is History of Rome, Revolutions, Storm Before the Storm, and the Lafayette book, is that the same characters pop up over and over. Just because you decide a particular stage is done or a particular period is over, you want to kind of put a cap on things, that doesn't mean they're over, because the people don't go anywhere. The memory of what has happened does not go anywhere. It sticks around and it has a formative influence on what follows.
Okay, so we got about 8 minutes. So here's the next question on the list. Do we listen to podcasts? And if so, what are your favorites right now? And let's just say like not each other.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I don't listen to a ton of history podcasts aside from Revolutions and History of Rome. Definitely. I listen to a ton of that. I listen to the Fall of Civilizations podcast from time to time. I really enjoy that one when it's an episode on a lost civilization that I really like. Otherwise, I mostly listen to sports podcasts. I like basketball podcasts and baseball podcasts, and that's about it. But like, since we moved and I don't have a lot of commuting time anymore, I find myself not listening to that much stuff. I'm reading a lot. I'm like actually reading physical books. I know.
We're selling books. Yeah, books. No, yes, books. Books are good now.
Yeah, no, pick it. God, what medium are we selling?
Yeah, what am I doing here?
What about you? What do you do? What do you listen to?
I'm kind of the same way that, you know, I'm working in history constantly. And I'm very supportive of all the history podcasts that are out there. But when it's time to do the dishes, you know, I am listening to Guardian Football Weekly.
That show is so good.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah, it's great. And I listen to Poznanski and Michael Schur's show. That's a really good one. Mm-hmm. And I also the other kind of mainstay for many, many years is Script Notes with John August and Craig Mazin. That's also a really good one, because those guys really, I mean, even if you're not into script writing necessarily, I mean, it's a show for script writers and people, you know, things that are interesting to script writers. Just the stuff they talk about and think about in that show, like, is always like we were talking about when it comes to narrative and how to build narrative and how to tell stories and what's important to people. I think, Script Notes has helped me a lot. Okay. Next question is from Shane. One of the interesting observations in The Verge is how printing houses were financially incentivized to print and spread the heated religious criticisms of Luther and others, and how this set the tone for later conflicts. Did modern social media's continual focus on engagement ever cross your mind while you were writing about this?
Yes, absolutely. I thought about it regularly, especially because I remain convinced that Luther was at heart a poster.
Right.
That Luther would have been right at home on Twitter or Reddit. Like Luther was like,
he was extremely online.
Luther was, and I think that's actually the key to understanding Luther, is that he was never going to like not check his mentions. He was always going to do that. And whenever he checked his mentions, he was going to reply. And that's what the Reformation is early on. It's Luther replying to his critics. It's not like there are these, you know, a ton of grand theological statements about who Luther is and what he believes and how he's laying out an alternative theological system. It's taking place in this context of debate and anger. So this is where these ideologies are being developed. This is where the seeds of the Reformation are being laid down. It's in this context of argument. And that's why, and like the printers benefited because people bought it, you know, like and in the same way that like Facebook benefits from engagement, Twitter benefits from engagement, Instagram benefits from engagement, Reddit wants people on Reddit talking about things that are on Reddit, you know, like there is a clear incentive for everybody to fan these flames to the extent that it suits them. You know, there's always the chance that like your print shop's going to get burned down if you print something that's too inflammatory. But I feel like, I thought about that parallel a lot.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, this is a very sort of, it's a reverberating cause and effect where, you know, people are leaning into it. Social media companies now and the printing companies back then are leaning into it because you can put out something that's nice and informative and doesn't make waves and people read it and it's nice. You put out something that makes people annoyed and angry and want to respond to it. Now you're creating like a feedback loop. And I think that that's just playing into human psychology. I don't think that social media is creating this, it's amplifying it. And as you say, it's fanning the flames. But there's a reason why when somebody says something dumb on Twitter, like we all like rush to do that. And you can try to fight it, but like you're fighting against what seems to me to be a very natural instinct.
Yeah. It's because at a really basic level, identity formation is oppositional. This is something anthropologists talk about this, psychologists talk about this, that your sense of who you are is much less a positive statement than it is, I am not that thing. It's not so much I am this as you look at something else and you say, well, I'm sure as hell not that. And that this is the way in which we craft our sense of who we are. And social media just puts that out there constantly, right? We're constantly confronted with others against whom to compare ourselves. And the printing press did the same thing, especially for Luther, that when he's getting this criticism, he's defining himself in response to this other thing. And that's literally the essence of what the Reformation is early on, is it's this blast and counterblast. And the fact that people got real worked up about it is not that surprising. And that's what ends up giving us these consequences down the road.
Yeah. Okay. So okay, we got 3 minutes. What historical site that either of you has personally visited impressed you the most? I know.
Man, that's a good one. That's a really good question. I am going to say, for me, Angkor Wat. I think the sheer scale of it was incredible. Not just the kind of stuff that's visible that you see on postcards or in like a picture on the internet, but like the stuff that's out there in the jungles that is completely overgrown, where you get a sense for this vast city complex, right? That stretches for mile after mile after mile after mile. And then the really humbling thought that there are way fewer people living there now than there were 800 years ago, you know? And so that was, it was a really humbling moment to think about the grand scheme of human societies and rising and falling and, you know, success and failure. Just realizing how much more populous that area of Cambodia was, you know, in the Middle Ages than it is today. And like the causes that would lead to that. And so that for me, it was really, really striking.
Yeah. And for me, I mean, I'm quite moved by inhabiting the space where things happened. And really, I mean, I have a list a mile long from, you know, from the Forum to going to, you know, you can go into the tennis court where, you know, they did the tennis court oath, which most people don't go to when they go to Versailles. They go see Marie Antoinette's bedroom, and then they miss the big room where everybody said, like, we're going to have a constitution or die. But I think I'm very similar to you. And I think it's possible my dad is out there, like, listening to this right now, like watching this. But my dad and I and some other people hiked the Inca Trail into Machu Picchu. And that, like, we came into Machu Picchu at sunset when most of the people who were sort of up there for the day had already boarded the buses and gone home. And we had about an hour before the very, very last bus went down. And we got about an hour mostly empty in Machu Picchu, which is what was an incredibly amazing experience. This thing that's built high up in the Andes, and it's incredible. I mean, obviously, like, thank the aliens, because only aliens could have done something like that. But I think that's what it is for me. I think it's Machu Picchu, but really, like, I love inhabiting spaces that great things happened in. So nobody's pulled the plug on us yet. I'm waiting to see if we get the hook here. And maybe this can go out. Like, we've talked about sort of what we've brought out of the academic world and into popular history world. But what can academic history learn from popular history? It's usually like we're going to the experts and learning from them to explain it to people. Is there anything that they can learn from us as they go about their business?
I mean, I feel like it's narrative, right? That this is a tool to be embraced and not shunned. And the corollary to that is that you've got to teach graduate students how to use the tools of narrative. And you've also got to teach graduate students how to do things like make a podcast, because it's not that hard, but it is a thing that you have to learn. Just that there are tools available for bringing history to the masses, and that's a worthwhile pursuit. Mm-hmm. I think that which those things go hand in hand. So having the tools to do that, and also the conviction that, like, it is in some sense incumbent upon academic historians, if they want people to know good history, that you've got to be willing to engage. You've got to be willing to put that out there. And that's hard because of the way the incentive structures in academia run. But I feel like there have to be more ways of making an effort on that front. Cause I just know from my program that was never emphasized at all. There was no sense that like, oh, go talk to the public.
Right. Right. And then they're like, well, what are these popular historians doing? Like talking about our work. It's like, well, somebody's got to do it, like I want to get it out there. And then this is from Ames. Hey, Ames, what's up, dude? What's the relationship like between history podcasting community and academia? There is some overlap of people. Like, I mean, you've got a PhD, you come out of the academic world, you escaped from it. But has the academy been welcoming of the attention you bring to the subjects, or skeptical of the mass appeal lens that we're putting on them? What do you hear from university professors? What do we say to them? What about high school teachers? What's your sort of relationship with the academic community right now? How are you feeling about it?
I feel pretty good about it. And I also want to say hi, Ames. Congratulations on winning the book, and congratulations on your baby, by the way. So relationship with academia, it's, for me, I will always have kind of a massive inferiority complex just because of like just a hangover from graduate school and being so worried about every word that I put on a page and how it could possibly be ripped apart. So that's always going to be in my head. I'm always going to be, to some extent, worried about what professional historians are going to say about my work. I would say historians engage with it less than academics in other fields do. So I feel like my work gets consumed by a lot of political scientists, economists, so people who are in related fields who want to think historically, but are not going to go out and read the specialist work, or are just like interested and want to know more about it and are looking for a good medium through which to engage. So I would say my experience with them has been really, really positive, including people who have done, kind of professional work on the periods that I've investigated. I feel like for me doing the prehistory series that I'm doing now, archaeologists have been amazing. I have had so many great conversations with archaeologists. And basically, whenever I've wanted to talk to a historian about something, they've been fairly open to it. But I feel like I've been welcomed by archaeologists in a way that I haven't by historians.
Yeah. Okay. And like my experience with it is that mostly, the people who I encounter, like online or just sending me emails, or people who are in who do engage with the public more, have been very happy and receptive and encouraging of everything that we're doing. And anytime I, voice some, what do you want to call it? Some inferiority complex, or maybe like I don't belong at the table because, I have a political science degree in philosophy, and then, it's just a bachelor's. I dropped out of grad school. So like, I'm always going to have that. Like, I don't have the piece of paper. But I'm mostly encountering people who are out there engaging with the public anyway. And I don't know what the people who aren't engaging with the public really think about any of this. I mean, are they just closed up, griping about it? What's the feeling? And like, I think one thing that I have gotten that is a complaint that I think is quite valid is that there are, maybe not us, maybe we do it to a certain degree, but that when we take this work, we just sort of take it as if it's just out there in the world and freely available. And, it wasn't the work of somebody doing something. It wasn't somebody had written a book. And there are podcasts out there that sometimes will just sort of they will just take like a story and then tell the story without telling anybody like where it came from or what books they read, or even really having a bibliography. And I think that's a pretty valid criticism that I've heard. But for the most part, I think, at least the people I've talked to, they when humanities is facing a massive funding crisis, and every single day you're looking at state legislatures and universities that are closing history departments and wanting to close humanities departments, people like us who are out there evangelizing for history as a not just a good thing, but an essential part of society, I think the feedback that I've gotten has always been very positive.
Yeah.
Okay, so now
you guys, this is the voice of Powell's.
Okay.
You guys are doing great, and everyone is really enjoying it. So you can go for another 10 minutes if you're up for it.
Oh boy. Okay. Are you good?
Absolutely.
10 minutes, go.
All right. So the next one is, okay, maybe hopefully you've seen this, maybe you haven't answered, because it's the one on top. Okay.
Oh yeah.
If you could put two historical figures that you wrote about in the octagon for an MMA match, who would you put in there and who would win?
Okay, so This is a good question. I have spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about this over the years, but it's Henry VIII and Abraham Lincoln. That so because I
Yeah,
hate
that's okay.
yeah, because I hate Henry VIII. I think he was a psycho, and I think that Abraham Lincoln would absolutely tune him up. I think Lincoln was like an accomplished backwoods wrestler, like renowned for his strength. I really like Henry VIII got humiliated by Francis the First of France in the Field of the Cloth of Gold in that wrestling match. I really want to see Abraham Lincoln just absolutely throw hands and toss Henry VIII around. I feel like that would be, I feel like that would be worth watching. That's at the top of my list.
Okay, I don't have an answer to this question. Because I don't have a background in MMA writing, and I don't do blood sports. I'm a civilized human being, so I don't know who I would.
I'm not. I'm very
Marius
uncivilized.
Sulla. Marius wins. There you go. I think Marius takes. I think Marius takes Sulla 1-on-1. Okay, what's the next question here? Okay, here we go. As an Josh asks, as an exclusively English speaker, reading exclusively English language texts, I realize I can only consume a fraction of history. What is a period or region of history you wish you had better access to from either language or governmental barriers? Any recommendations for a book topic outside the Western canon?
For me, it has to be China. I feel like in terms of like I think about demography a lot, and I think about the sheer weight of humanity, and like I think a lot about numbers of people and the kind of the aggregate weight of experience, and that makes China really, really important throughout the entirety of human history. You know, there have been a lot of people living in China since the Neolithic. The accumulated store of human experiences within the boundaries of what is now China is enormous. And I feel like we in the West do not have great access to that. I mean, I think it's getting better, and I think there's definitely more interest than there had been. But it's just there's a lot of stuff that people should know about things, and it's from a bunch of different perspectives, not just for understanding why the world is the way it is today, but as an alternative store of stories through which to understand the past and through which to understand ourselves. That, like, you know, there so often in the Western canon, we turn to this very limited number of examples through which to understand ourselves. You know, the Bible,
the Roman Empire, yeah. Empire, right?
Yeah, the Roman Empire.
We're all guilty of sin of that.
We're all saying it. We're all thinking it. That's so, and there's a whole lot of other stuff that's out there. I think that's the big one. I think India is another. I read a great book, India in the Persianate Age, that somebody randomly sent to me. They like sent it to Wondery, and I got it and I read it, and I was like, this is incredible. And just like, it was a mind expanding experience to go to a place that I hadn't been before. So yeah, I mean, I think definitely China, definitely India. There's just like, it's a big world. There's a lot of stuff out there that is far beyond Europe.
Yeah. And I mean, and I'm about to say something that's about Europe, but it does relate to this, is that, you know, I was working exclusively in English language material and translations, and producing English language stuff. And I wanted to write a book about the French Revolution, some aspect of it. And then, you know, this idea to write a biography of Lafayette came in, and there was a good like year or so where you know, actually, I guess a couple of years where I was like, yeah, but I can never do it because I don't speak French. I don't know how to read French. I didn't study French. I studied Japanese in high school. I don't know French. And so and the, you know, the ship has sailed. I'm like in my late 30s, you know, near death. So like, what's the point of even trying? And then one day I woke up and was like, I don't know, people learn French. Like, maybe I should just do it. And so I did what anybody does. I got on Duolingo and, you know, started learning, you know, je suis une pomme. Je suis une pomme rouge. Now I can say I am a red apple. Great. That's a very useful sentence. Thank you, Duolingo. And then I went on from there. But you can't, like, if you're exclusively an English speaker right now, there's nothing really stopping us from picking up that language that we wish that we had learned. And so I did it. My French is still quite terrible, according to my 9-year-old son, but I can read it. And it did open up that world to me. And then sort of the larger question of, like, you know, what is really impenetrable that you wish you could get into. I believe that right now I have told the story of this great, huge event that is the age of democratic revolution, the age of the Atlantic Revolution, which kind of starts at the end of the 7 Years' War when everybody starts reforming their colonial policy in the Americas. And I've told it in detail from the Europeans' perspective. I've told it in detail from the North American perspective, from the Caribbean perspective, and I have told it from the South American perspective. And Africa is sitting there, and I have not covered it. I have not gone into it. And if I was ever going to tell, and hopefully I'll be able to do this in the future, I'll be able to synthesize something like the Great Atlantic Revolution, that the African experience of that period is right now nothing that I've really engaged with on a serious level, and it's something that I want to correct. And so if we're living in a magical world where I'm automatically able to like learn the native language of these people that I would want to be covering, like that's what I want. I want to know what was going on in sub-Saharan Africa, like as the Portuguese start to show up, and what like that is such a critically important moment in history. And we don't like, even in the United States, we talk a lot about slavery now, but we don't really talk a lot about what was going on between like the Portuguese and the African coast. That is kind of just like, people were enslaved and then came over to the Americas, but we don't really talk much about what was ongoing in Africa at the time. And it's something that I'm going to becoming very interested in once Revolutions is over. Okay. So for both of us, is there, oh, great. Oh, this is where we get to realize that we've written a book and we can't undo it. This is always fun. Is there one anecdote or fact that you've been kicking yourself for not including after turning the final draft of your book in? Which of the 75 different things that you left on the cutting room floor do you wish you would put in the book? I don't know.
I wish I had included my metaphor of Columbus as a replacement level historical character in the book itself. And so I wrote a long essay on Columbus as a replacement level historical character for Defector, the successor website to Deadspin that should be out at some point in the next week or two.
This is Columbus as Bronson Arroyo.
This is Columbus as Bronson Arroyo,
right.
innings eating starter. That I wish I had gone heavier into the idea of that you could just replace Columbus with any number of other people of that place and time, people who were participants in this kind of violent maritime subculture that was heavily commercially driven, where they were willing to just do terrible things to make these profit margins back. That like you could replace Columbus with any one of these guys and the outcome is going to be very similar. I wish I had delved more into that, the kind of replaceability of Columbus and the ubiquity of characters like him, that I think because it was the sample chapter and because I knew that Columbus had name value, I think I probably gave him not too much credit, but I gave too much emphasis to the things that made him stand out as opposed to the ones that made him ordinary. Okay. And if I could go back, I think I would redress that balance a little bit. Not that I think I misrepresented Columbus, but I think that I would spend more time on that specific aspect.
Right. And then in putting the Lafayette biography together, I mean, when you're trying to squeeze a 74 years of life into 450 pages, like things are just, there are things that I just kind of skipped right over in terms of like an incident, and like just not knowing that question was coming. Like the thing that leaps immediately to mind is there's a whole business of a couple of months when there was the Dutch revolt that happened like in 1787, like preceding the French Revolution, where this is the thing that, this is happening on France's borders, and the Prussians are going to march in at the behest of the British to put down this revolt. And the fact that the French were unable to do anything about it because they were so financially just their house was in such disarray that they couldn't do anything about it. And it was a great moment of national shame and a great moment of realizing just how weak the monarchy was. And it is kind of like an adjacent cause, like not trigger, but thing. It's like indicating things are about to get really bad. And in this moment, Lafayette was in communication with those Dutch revolutionaries, and he thought that maybe they were about to call him to be the general of their armies. And he was in Fontainebleau with the king and was actually riding north to take command of these Dutch Patriot National Guard companies to possibly be their general. And in a ever so slightly different version of reality, that's like one of the big things that Lafayette did. But instead, it just kind of, it didn't happen. And he basically got a letter that said, we gave the job to somebody else. and then that revolt was immediately crushed, and like the story goes on. So like this was, you know, this was like 2 pages worth of material, but it doesn't ultimately go anywhere. So it's just like you got to just take it and set it aside, and it's, you know, it's on the cutting room floor. But there's lots of things like that that are out there where if they're not sort of ultimately playing up the main theme or the main story or contributing to what you're talking about, you kind of just you can't talk about everything, because if you do, then we'll, you know, that's like volumes and volumes and volumes.
Yeah. Oh God, I had a whole chapter on the Medici Pope Clement VII that I basically cut out. I think I wrote 6 pages of it, and then I emailed the editor, and I'm like, I think I'm just not going to do this chapter. I think I have everything I need here to do this, and it sucks because Clement VII is fascinating, and you know, the guy who gets his city sacked at the very beginning of the book, I wish I had gotten to spend a little more time with him and his family too, because he's a Medici, right? Like that would have been fascinating, but
but they don't let us write 10,000 page books.
No.
So and if you can't write a 10,000 page books, you know, you don't talk about some stuff. Okay, so this one is kind of addressed at me, but maybe we can talk about it here. Is I noticed that I have an undergraduate degree in political science, yet no degree in history, no master's or PhD. I was wondering if you could talk about your experience with self-education and advice for others. Oh my God, they're moving around. To educate themselves. Do you consider yourself an autodidact? I by definition, I'm an autodidact, which is just somebody who teaches themselves how to do something, which is very easy to do now in the world of books and the internet. But yeah, I talked about this a little bit. So I got my undergraduate degree in political science and philosophy, and walked out of that not really wanting to do political science and not really wanting to do philosophy anymore. But in both of them, I had to study a great deal of history. Like studying political science and philosophy both involved a great deal of history, and that's what I wanted to keep going with. And then so I just started reading myself, and you know, my path into this was, of course, just reading secondary sources that I found interesting. And then as I progressed further, I would start reading bibliographies. Okay. And like that, this is a great thing. Like, read a bibliography. If there was something in the book that particularly struck you, there's probably a book, like if there's one paragraph in a book that was really interesting to you, there's probably an entire book about that one paragraph that was informing that one paragraph. I can tell you that's how it works. And so I will look through bibliographies. I read the acknowledgments of things. I find out who authors were basing their work off of. And then that slowly but surely took me to just picking up the collected memoirs of this person or the collected correspondence of that person. Or of course, you know, in terms of the history of Rome, like reading all of Livy and Polybius and reading those sort of quote unquote primary sources. Now, when I was done with the history of Rome, I was going to get a master's degree in public history, because my passion, I don't really want to be in the academic world. I don't want to be just writing for other academics. I think my calling and my passion is writing for a popular audience. So I was going to get a master's degree in public history, and in part, I think because I wanted to learn it, and I wanted to learn the techniques, and I wanted to also prove to myself that I could do graduate level work, that I wasn't just somebody who was just kind of flighting his way through things. Then my wife got a job, so I had to drop out of that master's program. So now I at least get to say I'm a grad school dropout, which everybody kind of understands out there. But I think that really, like, when it comes to advice for how to self-teach yourself, I think it's reading broadly. And then I think really you have to read against what comes naturally to you, if that makes any sense at all. Where if you're only reading things that are kind of confirming what you already believe about the world, I don't think you're getting anywhere, and you're not really making any progress as a person, or as when it comes to actually learning new things. You do need to be picking up books that challenge you, and you do need to be picking up books that challenge your perception of things, that maybe tell you things that you don't necessarily agree with. And that's the best thing. If you're going to teach yourself, you have to be willing to push yourself. And there's a lot of people out there who have read a lot of books. They've read 1,000 books. They've read 10,000 books. But maybe those 10,000 books never actually challenge them to think about something new in a different way. And if you're not doing that, then you're not really learning anything new. You're just developing a more sophisticated version of the reality that you already know.
I completely agree with that. And I mean, I think that's probably a fairly good note for us to pull things to a close here, is that, yeah, I think there's a whole world out there, right? There's a whole array of books, YouTube videos, articles, whatever. I feel this especially keenly at the moment with all the stuff that I'm doing on prehistory, with just how accessible it is. You know, like you can pull up for free cutting edge papers on ancient DNA, you know, like that the stuff is out there. So I think it's important to understand what it is you're trying to do. And if what you're trying to do is become a better and more well-rounded person, then just read widely.
Right, yeah.
Just go all over the place. If you're interested in history, don't just read Roman history. Read the history of India, read the history of sub-Saharan Africa. There's a great book on the economic history of West Africa called A Fistful of Shells that I highly recommend. That, like, because you don't know how even if you're focusing on something else and your real interest is this other thing, that other stuff is going to inform you in profound ways. It's going to help you ask better questions. It's going to help you ask different questions. And this is true if you're an academic too. You should read outside your field. You should, because the whole point is, like, you can't answer a question you can't formulate, or that you don't know to ask, you know? And the only way that you're going to get a sense for the kind of breadth of questions that are available for you to ask about the world is by reading outside the things that you're most comfortable with. I firmly agree with that.
And the last point that I'll make about this will be good. We can end on this because it will bring us back around to your book. Is I told you this when I read the book, because I was reading it, and I was reading, you know, I'm reading about like Queen Isabella, and I'm reading about Christopher Columbus, and I'm reading about Jakob Fugger. Is that how you pronounce it? Am I getting
Jakob
it right?
Fugger.
Yep. Anyway, so anyway, I'm reading about Jacob Fugger, and and then I get to this chapter that's going to be about this medium small time wool merchant in England, and I'm kind of like, you know, flipping through it and seeing what's coming up ahead, and I'm like, I wonder if I could just skip this chapter, because I do need to finish reading this book. But no, I'll see how it is. And because, you know, am I interested in the comings and goings of a wool merchant in England at this time? Like, it's not my passion. And then it turned out to be my favorite chapter in the whole book. So we don't actually know what we like and don't like until we establish things, right? Until we actually read things. And you can say, I don't think I'll like that. I don't think I will think that that is interesting. But the number of times that I have encountered something that I didn't think I would think was interesting and then found fascinating, it's happened so much that it's just, it is proof that you shouldn't be turned off of something just because you don't think you'll be interested.
Yeah, the worst thing that you can do is, that's my book. And the worst thing that you can do is stop reading it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you read 6 pages and it sucks, close the book. Like, you should always feel free to abandon the book, or abandon the TV series, or abandon the podcast if it doesn't interest you anymore. Like, you're not locked into that. That's the sunk cost fallacy, you know? And like, I feel, I know we're running up on the end of the time here, and I feel like you summed that up really beautifully, and I screwed it up. But I just wanted to thank you.
We'll edit that part out of the podcast.
Yeah, Mike, I just wanted to thank you. And I want to thank all y'all at Powell's for this. This was an incredible experience, and I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, thanks so much, Patrick. Thanks, Mike. Somebody was talking, saying that we should do this a weekly thing. So tune in next week, and we'll all be here again. No, I'm just kidding. All right. So
there's
thanks,
only 75 more questions to answer.
I know you guys could just make a whole new book out of answering all those questions. Thanks again for everyone tuning in. Here is a link in the chat to our YouTube channel. And you can view all of our events there. And this event will be popping up there probably sometime tomorrow if you want to pass it on to your friends to watch. Make sure to buy Patrick's book as well. And I will put the link in the chat right there for you as well. Mike, your book's coming out really soon. So folks, make sure to look out for that. And thank you so much. It was such a great talk. We went into overtime, but it seemed like a lot of people really appreciated that. So it was fascinating the whole way through. So thank you so much, you guys. And thanks everyone for watching, and have a good night.
Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.